title of the series is Good News for All. That is the message of the Bible. It is good news for all people. Jesus has come for all of humanity. And we're going to continue in Luke chapter 6 this morning. And the title of this message today is Let Him Work. Let Him Work. And it says this in Luke 6, verse 12 to 16. One day, soon afterward, Jesus went up onto a mountain to pray. And he prayed to God all night. At daybreak, he called together all of his disciples and chose 12 of them to be apostles. Here are their names: Simon, who he named Peter; Andrew, Peter's brother; James and John; Philip, Bartholomew; Matthew, Thomas; James, son of Alphaeus; Simon, who was called a zealot; Judas, son of James; Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. Now, I don't know if there are any Liverpool fans in the room this morning. Any Liverpool fans? Yes, David. Yeah, my brother Nat as well. There's 3 of us here this morning. But if you're a Liverpool fan, if you're a big football fan, then you'll know for us Liverpool fans, it's been a very difficult few weeks. It's been a hard few weeks. Not only have Liverpool missed out on winning the biggest trophy in English football, British football, the Premier League, but our beloved manager has left. His name's Jurgen Klopp. There he is, a photo of him right there. And he's been the manager of Liverpool for the last 9 years. And he's been a man who has turned around the fortunes of Liverpool. He's made every doubter a believer. He has come in and he's totally transformed Liverpool Football Club. He is the greatest Liverpool manager in my time. I know in Nat's time. I don't think for Dave's time, but he is for my time. I know that. He's the greatest Liverpool manager. Sorry, Dave. But this week, as he's finished, as the season's finished, he's decided to leave, that his time is done. And he gave his final interview this week. He was invited back to Liverpool and he had a conversation. It was an interview with a big stadium, a big crowd of people. And in this interview, he was being asked to reflect on his time at Liverpool and to look back at this journey. He has done so much for the club, winning every single trophy that is possible. And he was reviewing his time. And as he began to share in this interview, he made a very interesting comment. And it was something that I listened to, and it stuck with me a little bit. And he said this in his final interview. He said, "We should be happy that we have these owners and not the guys who bought London clubs and other stuff." He says, "I wouldn't have survived a year at Liverpool." What is he going on about here? What is Jurgen Klopp getting at with this comment? Well, he was saying that the owners of Liverpool, who are American owners, that they have given him something much more better than money. A lot of other managers, a lot of Liverpool fans would say that Jurgen Klopp hasn't been given enough money so he could buy the best players in the world so that he could win even more trophies than he did. But he said, "I'm thankful that we have these managers. Although the fans might complain about these owners of the club," he said, "I'm thankful for the owners because they have given him something more important than money." What is that thing that they have given Jurgen Klopp? Well, they give him time. They give him time. They were patient with him. In other words, they let him work. They let him do his job. They let him do his job and they trusted in him and they gave him time. Many other clubs want instant success. They want the best manager and they want to win straight away. But Liverpool owners decided they would stick with Jurgen Klopp, whether he would win or lose, because they trusted that over time, he would change the fortunes of the club. And that's what they did. Things didn't go well in the early years of Jurgen Klopp's reign. He didn't win any big trophies, but over time, he delivered on his promise. They trusted him and they allowed him to work, and it's paid off massively. He's leaving the club with an incredible legacy. You know, it's an important thing to be given time, to trust somebody to do their job. And you know, as we come to Luke chapter 6, We actually see that lesson here. We see that lesson happening here with somebody who's even greater than Jurgen Klopp. We see that happening now. As we come to the end of Luke chapter 5 and Luke chapter 6, we see that Jesus, he's changing his ministry. He'd been ministering in different towns and villages for over a year, but now he's going to establish this team together. He's going to put together a group of people who will carry on his mission after he dies on the cross, rises again, and ascends into heaven. He's going to gather together a group of disciples, but not only disciples who would be followers, but a group of apostles. He's going to put together these leaders, or the word apostle means messengers or authorized representative. Out of all his followers, he's going to choose a select group so that they would be the ones to carry on his message and spreading the good news of Jesus throughout the world. It is the message that we preach, the message we have received, the message that we declare even today. So Jesus decides, out of all these followers, there were many people following him, hundreds of people who would have followed him. But Jesus decides to choose 12 apostles. Why does he choose 12 apostles? Well, the number 12 is significant because it matches the 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament. It represents God's foundation, the foundation of God's people. Jesus said this in Matthew 19, verse 28. He said, I assure you that when the world is made new and the Son of Man sits upon his glorious throne, you who have been my followers will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. We see that Jesus, just like with the 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament, he's choosing 12 apostles who will carry on his mission. He's making all things new. He's establishing this new covenant. And we see here that Jesus chooses 12 out of all his followers who would be the leaders to carry on his mission. So who were these 12 apostles? Who were the 12 disciples who are the most famous? Well, that's a photo. It's not of the original 12. This is actually a cast. Unfortunately, they didn't have iPhones back then. But this is a TV series, a modern TV series called The Chosen. And these are the actors who play the 12 disciples. I'd recommend that series, by the way. But we see the 12 disciples mentioned here, the 12 apostles who Jesus chooses. It says it in verse 13 to 16. He chooses Simon, whose name is Peter. He names Andrew, who's Peter's brother, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, or another name for Bartholomew is Nathaniel, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who's the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot. So these were the 12 men who Jesus chose out of all his followers to be his apostles. Now you'd think that Jesus would choose some from a select group, wouldn't you? You think that when Jesus was choosing those who would be his representatives, those who would go on to lead the church, you'd think he'd choose the best of the best. You'd think that Jesus would choose the best religious teachers, or maybe those with political power, or maybe even those who were the strongest in the Roman army at that time. You'd think that Jesus would choose the best of the best. But Jesus does something completely opposite. He brings together ordinary men. He chooses ordinary men from different backgrounds. These men who represented a wide range of political beliefs, people with different life experiences, people with a variety of different personalities as well. You know, if you've ever read the Bible, you'll discover, and especially if you've read the book of Acts, you'll see how God used these men to do incredible things for him, how they went on to preach about Jesus with boldness, how they performed signs, wonders, and miracles in the name of Jesus. These were guys who were used by God to lead the early church. These 12 were used, along with others, to turn the world upside down for Jesus. God used these men in incredible ways. And if you've read the Bible and you read about these men and learn about these men, you'll think just like me, I wish I was like them. I wish I was like Peter, or I wish I was like John, or I wish I was like James. I wish I knew Jesus that closely, or I wish I was used by God to do those things in those ways for God. I certainly do that when I look at these men. These seem like spiritual elite, that they are different from us, a different breed of people, a different caliber of people if God used them. However, I often forget, and I think sometimes we often forget, that these 12 who did amazing things in the name of God and did amazing things for God, they didn't start off in that way. They didn't start off in that way. They weren't the perfect super Christians who many of us look at their lives and think, I wish I was like them. They weren't the perfect super Christians. In fact, when Jesus calls them in Luke chapter 6, when he first chooses them, he knows that they're not perfect. He knows their background. He knows their personalities. Yet despite that, he still chooses them. I want us to have a closer look at these 12 men this morning. Here's a bit of a background. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. I hope, but I'll read it out to you. Here's a little bit of a background for each one. This is when Jesus originally called these men. When he called Simon Peter was a fisherman. That's what he was. History tells us and the Bible tells us that Simon Peter, he was impulsive. He was very quick to speak. He put his foot in his mouth often. He would often speak without thinking, and he got things wrong an awful lot of the time. He was quite rash, Simon Peter was. He was like a bull in a china shop. That was like Simon Peter. Then you've got Simon's brother, Andrew. He was another fisherman as well. He was just an ordinary, everyday person. We see James. He was somebody who was ambitious, but he was also very short-tempered as well, and he was very judgmental towards other people. You've got John, whose brother was James, and he was ambitious as well. He wanted to be number one in the group of the apostles. He wanted to be number one there. Then you've got Philip, this other man who was a fisherman as well, and he was somebody who would question. He was often skeptical. He had this skeptical attitude about things. You've got this man called Nathaniel, Bartholomew, not my brother here, but he as well, he was skeptical. He didn't believe where Jesus was from, Nazareth. He didn't think that anything good could come out of Nazareth. Then you've got another man, his name was Matthew, and in society's eyes, he would have been the worst of the worst. People wouldn't have understood how Jesus called him because Matthew was a tax collector. He was somebody who almost betrayed the Jewish people to work for the Romans. He was despised. He was ostracized by society. He would have probably been a little bit dishonest in his work as well, given some for Rome and taken a little bit of money for himself as well. He would have been somebody like that. Then you've got a man called Thomas, who many of us know his name is Doubting Thomas. He's known for doubting that Jesus rose again from the grave. You've got a man called James, son of Alphaeus, and he wasn't very prominent. He wasn't very influential compared to society's standards. We know very little about this man. You've got Judas, son of James, or his other name is Thaddeus, and not much is known about him either. There's another man called Simon the Zealot, and he was this Jewish nationalist who wanted to violently overthrow the Romans. He was fiercely patriotic. He would have been a bit of an assassin in his time, this man would have been. And then we've got Judas Iscariot. He was deceitful, he was greedy, and he later betrayed Jesus. Talk about a motley crew. Talk about, this crew who've come together, these ordinary people, just like me, just like you. People from ordinary jobs, nobodies who lived in little places in the Middle East. People who the world wouldn't have even known. People who messed up and who failed. Yet, when they seen Jesus, Jesus called them. They met Jesus, and it's amazing that after these men met Jesus, their lives were turned around. These ordinary people who would often mess up, and even when they did meet Jesus, they would sometimes mess up. But it's amazing to see the transformation after they met Jesus. I've got another slide here just to show the transformation in their life. Simon Peter, well, he became bold in preaching about Jesus, and he was a foundational leader in the early church. We've got Andrew, who had a passion to bring people to Jesus, and he was somebody who worked behind the scenes. We've got James, somebody who was so committed to Jesus despite his flaws, and actually, he was one of the first martyrs, one of the first ones to still believe in Jesus and get killed for his faith in Jesus. You've got John, who later went on to write the Gospel of John, who penned the most famous Bible verse of all, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. This man, John, this ambitious guy, who's encountered the love of Jesus and spoke about the love of Jesus and turned his life around. We got Philip, who overcame his skepticism, and he played a significant role in making Jesus known across the world. We've got Nathaniel, who became a missionary, and he was known for his honesty and his dedication. You've got Matthew, who ended up writing the Gospel of Matthew and shared the teachings of Jesus far and wide. We got Thomas, who, although he doubted Jesus, he overcame his doubts, and he became a courageous missionary going throughout the world. And his history tells us that he went as far as India preaching about Jesus. You've got James, son of Alphaeus, and he faithfully served Jesus alongside the other apostles. You've got Thaddeus as well, who spread the message of Jesus faithfully alongside the others. We've got Simon the Zealot, this political guy. He channeled his passion and he spread the message of Jesus peacefully. It's amazing, this. And unfortunately, even there we see Judas. He tragically betrayed Jesus and he later took his own life. He couldn't accept what he had done. But we see here, for the majority of these men, ordinary men who had failed and who were in society's eyes nobodies, but yet Jesus chose them. I know it's amazing that they became like this after they met Jesus and after Jesus began to work in their lives. We see, as you read throughout the Gospel of Luke and you read throughout the Bible, that it was over time, as these men were with Jesus and came to Jesus, that Jesus began to work in their lives bit by bit, began to change them, and that's how they became these men who made a difference in our world. God worked in their lives. It wasn't an overnight change, but by coming to Jesus, being called by Jesus and spending time with Jesus, Jesus transformed them. He worked in and through their lives. As I said, some of them still messed up. They still got it wrong, but they experienced the forgiveness of God. They experienced his grace and his mercy, and they became examples for you and me as well. You know, it's amazing that Jesus didn't expect them right from the beginning to be perfect. He didn't choose them because they were perfect. Instead, Jesus saw their potential. He saw their obedience. He saw their willingness to trust in him. And over time, Jesus worked in and through their lives, and they became pillars in the early church. That's what Jesus does in our lives. He transforms us from the inside out. And I wonder this morning, as I began to pray over this message, as I felt God just speaking to me and even speaking to my heart in this, I wonder today, have you given Jesus time to work in your life? Have you given him time to work in your life? I've mentioned it recently, but there's a Greek word that I heard, and this word is called magis. And this word means that I'm not where I want to be, but I'm better than where I was. That there's been a transformation in my life. It speaks of growth. It speaks of progress. It speaks of change within our lives. And so it is within our Christian lives as well. There is a Bible word for this, a Christian word for this, and it's called sanctification, where we open up our lives to Jesus and where God begins to change us from the inside out over time. The Bible says we are being changed from glory to glory, being made more and more like Jesus and making him known in our lives. It's a change within our lives. However, I wonder how many of us get frustrated sometimes about where we might be within our walk with the Lord, about where we might find ourselves, where we sometimes keep messing up within our lives, where there's things that we'd like to change, but that change doesn't come quick enough within our lives. Maybe you see some Christians on social media or in other churches, or you see them online and you think, I'll never be as good as that person. I'll never be like him. I'll never be as perfect like her. Maybe you were a little bit like that. You know, sometimes even in our Christian lives. We can be hard on ourselves. We can put ourselves down. And, I'm guilty of this. Just ask George. I can be like this as well. I wish I was like this. I wish that God would work in me a little bit more. I wish God would keep working in this area within my life. But, recently, I have a pastor friend who shared a word with me, and it was just an encouraging word. It was a phrase, actually, that I've never heard before. Some of you might know him. His name is Robin. He's from Abraham and Apostolics Church, and he's a great friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, and somebody who has been a great example for me, even in recent years. And we were chatting in a recent pastors meeting, and he said to me recently, he said that, Luke, you need to give grace space. You need to allow God to keep working in your life. Give grace space. And I believe this morning, as I prayed over this message, I believe that's a word for somebody here today. Just give grace space. Let God keep working in your life. You might have come here today and you might not be where you want to be, but keep opening your heart to Jesus. Keep opening your life to Him and let grace work. Give grace space. Allow Jesus to bring the transformation in your life. His job is the transformation. Our job is openness, obedience, and availability to Him, and being obedient to when He tells us to change. He's the one who brings change within our lives. And we must trust Him to work within our lives as we keep opening our lives to Him. As we come to a conclusion of this message this morning, I just want to end by sharing a story. It's a story from a book that I recently purchased up in the Assemblies of God conference. It was actually George bought me this book, so I won't take any credit for that, George. But she bought me this book, and it was from this pastor, Assemblies of God pastor, who's from Bolton. And he's actually on the national leadership team. I think I got a photo of him. There he is. His name's Derek Smith. He's a brilliant guy. He's just so down to earth, so real, so honest, just an amazing guy who's been used by God. And he's sharing in this book that I bought, he shares about this mission trip that he took to Scotland, of all places. He's in Bolton, but he took a missions trip to Scotland because there was an Assemblies of God church up in Scotland that was struggling. It needed some help. So they asked him if he could go in for a month and just give them some guidance, just help them out a little bit. So Derek took a team with him and they went up to Scotland. And he said that when he was in this church, they did an outreach into the community, and he met this young man on the streets. And this young man actually attended this church from time to time. And he said this young man was a similar age to him. And he goes on to describe this young man. He says that this young man attended the church because of a family link. His parents were actually in church, and he used to go to church, but he stopped going to church. And he begins to share what this man looked like. He said that this man was a biker. He was a motorbiker. He said he had this AC/DC t-shirt on. He had ripped jeans on. He had these big biker boots and all these things. He had piercings. He had tattoos. And he said that this was the man who he was beginning to speak about. And he began to talk to this young man. And he said to him, Derek said to this young man, he said, come along to church. I'd love for you to come along to church on one Sunday. He said, I'm going to be preaching. I'd love for you to be there. So he says that he was there on a Sunday service, and Derek was preaching, and he was preaching about Saul and the Damascus Road, and about how this incredible conversion after the man's soul encountered Jesus and his life was changed. And Derek said he was preaching in this service, and he said he looked out at the end of the service and he could see this young man, this motorbiker. He said he could see him sitting at the back of the church, and he said he had his head in his hands. He was looking down. So Derek went up to him and he spoke to him. He said, it's great to see you. He said, is everything all right? He said, is there something I can pray for you, pray about for you? And the young man turned to him and said, I want to know this Jesus who you've been preaching. He said, I want to give my life to Jesus. He said, how do I do this? So Derek goes on to say, and he says that he had the privilege of leading this young man to Jesus. He said, what a privilege it was leading him back to the Lord. And so Derek says to him, he says, look, he says, I want you to come again to church this week. He says, we've got a discipleship class. We've got a Bible study where we can teach you a little bit about the basics of Christianity. So he said, come along this week. And he said, it'll be great for you. It'll be a good help to you. So he says, on Thursday night, Derek says he was standing outside this church in Scotland, waiting for this young man. And he said he could hear his motorbike boots clattering on the street. He said he could hear him coming. And this man came, but he said, although he had these motorbike boots on, he said this young man looked completely different. He had a suit on, he had a tie, he had a shirt, he'd had his hair cut, all his piercings were taken out. And Derek said, I was a little bit confused about this. He said, I didn't understand what was going on. He said, what a transformation. Or was it really? He said, what was going on here? So Derek asked him, he says, what's with the new look? Why have you put a suit on? Why are you looking so smart? Why have you changed? Why have you washed? Why have you done these things? He said, what's the deal with this? Well, the young man explained to Derek that after the service, after he'd given his life to Jesus, he went home to his parents and he told his parents about this decision that he had made, that he'd become a Christian. His parents then sat him down and told him that if he really wanted to be a real Christian, that he'd have to sell his motorbike, that he'd have to get rid of his ear piercings, that he'd have to buy a suit, that he'd have to behave and he'd have to act in a certain way, and only then would he be a real Christian. Only if he looked a certain way. They told him he had to get rid of his rock music and all these things, and only then he would be a Christian. Well, Derek writes in the book, he said, I wanted to scream and I wanted to go and find his parents. He said, what have this young man's parents done? He goes on to say that this young man's parents have done what many Christians, what many churches, sadly to say, what even I do sometimes. He says, we teach people how to behave. We tell people to look the part and act a certain way. But we don't allow God to work in their lives and bring that change naturally and organically in his time. Derek explained to the young man that it wasn't about what he listened to, what he wore, what he looked like, but he said the damage was already done. He says he was now a good Christian boy who didn't want to embarrass his parents any longer. And he said that the parents said to him when they came to that meeting, they said, look, our son's back to normal now. He's back to normal. And he said it broke his heart. Well, after a few months, Derek had left the church and he phones the pastor and he asked the pastor, he says, how's this young man doing in your church? Has he kept coming along? Well, the pastor said he said to Derek, shortly after that Derek left and his team left, he said the young man drifted back to his old lifestyle. He grew his hair back, he put his piercings in, and he bought his bike again, and he hasn't darkened the doors of the church since. He said that his parents were absolutely devastated that he's gone back to his old lifestyle and he never, ever attends church again. You know, his parents were good people. They were people who loved the Lord. They had good intentions, but they forgot that Jesus is the one who brings change and not us. We can tell people to behave. We can tell people to look a certain way, but it's only Jesus who can bring transformation. He's Lord of their lives. We aren't Lord of people's lives. What this young man needed was a church and a family who would accept him, who would see past his clothes and just love him where he was and lead him to Jesus, to show the love of Jesus, to teach Jesus, to model Jesus, and allow Jesus to work within his life. And you know, sadly, that's the story of countless other people, countless people in our families, our community, and nation. You know, as a church, we need to give grace space. We need to allow God to work in people's lives in his time, in his way. He'll deal with it all. We don't have to. He is able to do it. I wonder this morning, what would our church really look like if we gave grace space? If we allowed Jesus to really work in people's hearts and lives? I wonder this morning, how many people would still be here if we allowed Jesus just to work in their lives instead of forcing things on people? How many people, I wonder this morning, could we win for Jesus if we just preached him, shared his love, and allowed him to work in people's lives? You know, as we come to an end today, I want you to know this isn't a super grace message. I'm not saying this morning that live any way that you can and God will forgive you, because we do need to work with God. We need to allow God to work in our lives. We do have to obey and follow him. We have to trust him, and that's what we want people to do. But I believe the Lord wants to encourage us this morning and maybe encourage you Just allow him to work in your life. Open up your heart to him. Allow him to speak into your life and change your life. Let's lead people to Jesus and trust him to do the rest. That's all we are called to do, is the Holy Spirit, God who convicts people, changes people, saves people. We are just to bring people to Jesus and to allow him to work in their lives. And then we as a church, we're to support them. We're to love them. Keep teaching Jesus and pointing people to Jesus. Today, I want to encourage us. Let's give grace a little space. Let's allow God to work in people's lives. And as we do that, we'll become the people who God has called us to be and created us to be. And I want to end with this passage of scripture. Philippians 1 verse 6. And I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. He'll do it. Let him work. Amen.